The way today is going to work is to have a bit of a lecture and discussion, thinking about what zoonoses are and why they matter, looking a little bit at some of the dynamics of transmission of diseases from animals to people and the factors that affect those. And so this is very much fitting in with the part of this course that's looking at the environmental context of health, the relationships between processes that affect health and those that are part of wider livelihoods and agriculture and people's uses of natural resources and environments and so on. So that'll be a key theme that comes through here and that I think we'll pick up on, but speak in some slightly different ways to the other sessions you've had on environmental health, the session with Linda and so on. And then also in this lecture we're going to think a little bit about some of the policy challenges of dealing with zoonoses, but in a way that also picks up on the idea of epidemics, so there'll be a bit of a crossover with thinking about epidemics more generally. And the idea, again, which we introduced a bit in the vaccine session, around the ways that different narratives and storylines can become part of the politics of policy processes. So what are zoonoses? Basically what we're talking about here is diseases that are carried by animals and exist in a reservoir in animals. Whether or not they cause symptoms and make those animals sick, but they're there, they become transmitted from animals to people. And it's estimated now that actually around 60% of all the diseases that affect human beings had their origins in viruses or bacterial infections that started in animals. So basically an awful lot of what we deal with in human health has zoonotic origins. And when we think particularly about some of the more recent infections that have caused problems for people and problems around the world, around 3/4 of those so-called emerging infectious diseases are zoonoses. And some of those are very much things that we've seen hitting the headlines over the last few years, and these were just a couple of snippets from BBC. I mean, this is the avian flu crisis in 2003, 2005, headlines around avian flu, bird flu, and then this one was around deadly viruses linked to bats. So this is an issue that's often hitting the headlines. It's rising up, I think, public agendas, but they're also increasingly recognised as very serious public health problems, which are attracting more and more attention from scientists, from policymakers. And just two examples of that. Yesterday, the results were announced of a very big cross-UK Research Council and DFID programme called ZELS, Zoonoses in Emerging Livestock Systems, which is now attracting about £10 million of research funding to put science and policy behind tracking the causes and consequences of emerging zoonotic diseases. And the European Union's new Horizon 2020 research funding programme has a big tranche of work on societal challenges, has identified zoonotic disease and emerging global pandemics as key areas. So this is quite a big issue, and it's partly an issue because zoonoses do have a very high impact overall on human health, but also because some zoonoses also make animals sick. That has an impact on people who depend on those animals for their livelihoods, so livestock keepers, herders, pastoralists, and indeed not just smallholders, but people who work with even more industrial production systems. So there's a big impact on the economy and livelihoods through animal sickness. This is also an area where some of the burdens are felt most strongly amongst the poorest populations. And the report by Delia Grace and colleagues that I put on the reading list notes that actually zoonoses probably underlie around 20% of all human sickness at the moment in the lowest income countries. And that's in contexts where you're not counting in malaria and diarrheal diseases and some of the other things we're talking about. But it's also the case that some of the public health problems that wouldn't be thought about as zoonoses now, because we've almost forgotten their animal origins, actually did have origins as animal diseases. And malaria is one, but HIV is probably the biggest example, with its origins in simian viruses in Central Africa. And then there was a process by which it jumped to people and then spread in all sorts of ways. So this is quite a big issue at a number of different levels. It's also just an issue that really forces us to think about the wider factors and big changes in societies and economies and environments that interrelate with patterns of infectious disease and burdens of them. And we'll go into some more details shortly, but just quite broadly, these are some of the big sweeps of historical change that are really quite significant to understanding how zoonotic diseases emerge and how they spread. So we're partly talking about things like the ways transitions emerge from people who were living mainly through hunting and gathering, then to agriculture and more intensive agriculture. We're talking about the ways that travel and colonization has led diseases to be able to spread around the world, the impacts of hygiene, antimicrobials and how they work, and then a lot of issues to do with increasing human populations and increasing animal populations. And interestingly, in human history, of course, they've gone together. And over the last half century, we've seen not just massive increases in human populations, but also massive increases in animal populations and in populations of domestic animals. And then on top of all of those things, we've got a situation where people, and indeed animals, are being moved around the world very much more through travel, through trade in livestock and livestock products. And so these are some of the big picture issues that I think we need to take into account in thinking about zoonoses in general. But they work out in very different ways in different places. So this is just a quick map that comes from Kate Jones's research group based at UCL, who are actually partners in a programme we're working on called Dynamic Drivers of Disease in Africa. And this just shows what they've identified as emerging infectious disease events over the last sort of 6 decades or so. An event being where a disease is recognised newly for the first time, or a disease is recognised in a place where it hadn't been before. As she shows, more than 60% of those are zoonotic, and they're emerging in all sorts of different places around the world. This was an update that they added in 2012, which showed some things like there's lujovirus in South America here. There are a whole bunch of different viruses, but the point is really that this is just an update over the last few years. Not all these emerging disease events are being picked up. There are huge problems of diagnosis and surveillance. You don't necessarily know that they're there, but even from the ones that are being picked up, there are a lot. And what this really suggests is that out there in nature, in wild animals, living in forests, living in plains, living in environments, there's actually an enormous reservoir of viruses. Animals carry all sorts of viruses. And they are, I mean, the way more dramatic researchers put it, are kind of sitting there as a time bomb waiting to happen. It's only a matter of time before genetic mutations and closer interactions between people and those animals jump, and then we've got an emerging disease in people. These that are being identified could be argued to be just a tip of the iceberg. But if that's a general picture, how might we break down and begin to disaggregate these zoonoses a little bit more thoroughly? Well, there are lots of ways of doing that. One way of thinking about them and dividing them up might be to think about sort of temporality. We've got some zoonoses that are endemic. They're just there as a kind of stratum of disease in populations. They affect many people, they affect many animals in a day-to-day way, and those are just a few examples. But there are others that may exist in a human population but have a much more of an outbreak form, an epidemic form. And so Ebola, which you've been looking at, would be an example of that. So would be something like Rift Valley fever, which is a disease transmitted between small domestic animals in much of East Africa and people, and it involves mosquitoes. But it seems that it takes very seasonal forms and produces epidemics that are associated with particular patterns of wet seasons and climate which allow the mosquitoes to flourish. So those could be zoonoses that are already diseases in human populations. But then there are this category of emerging zoonoses, which is a slightly odd category because the way it's often used in the literature, it's either a disease which appears for the first time that nobody knew about before, so those kind of viral events on that map. And the term emerging is also used for diseases that might have existed in a population somewhere already causing disease in a human population, but are now becoming much more virulent or appearing in places where they didn't exist before. For instance, people talk about the emergence of malaria associated with climate change in places which were previously too dry and too cold for Anopheles mosquitoes to flourish, but malaria is now, as it were, re-emerging, for instance, in some parts of southern Europe. That's one way, then, of thinking about the timing. Another way of kind of breaking down the zoonosis box is to think about who are the animal hosts and what kind of mechanisms of transmission are we talking about. So there we've got some diseases that are transmitting directly from livestock to people, and avian flu would be an example in its transmission from particularly chickens and ducks to people, or again Rift Valley fever, as I've just mentioned, from its small livestock. But then there are some that transmit from livestock to people but only via insect vectors. An example there might be trypanosomiasis or sleeping sickness, which is found in big belts across large parts of southern Africa. People only get it via tsetse flies that bite animals and then bite people. And there are versions which make both animals and people sick. There are then those that are more associated with wildlife and that transmit from wildlife to people. And both Nipah virus and Ebola are examples there. Another is Lassa fever, which is a disease I've been working on a bit in Sierra Leone, which is transmitted by this little Mastomys mouse, which looks terribly harmless and actually hangs out in people's houses and eats their food and then urinates on that food. And that's thought to be the main route through which people get this really very nasty hemorrhagic fever. But around transmission mechanisms, there's still a lot that's not known. So, for instance, in the case of Lassa, people think that it's urination on food, but they're not sure. There might actually be direct bites that people sometimes have. It's not clear how long body secretions from these Mastomys mice can hang about in the environment, so it's actually quite difficult to know who's at risk where. And there are questions also about how much it transmits from people to people. So these are all very live areas of research at the moment. And something else to emphasise about, particularly these emerging zoonoses, is that they're very new. So there's a little bit of a frontier to understand both the dynamics of the virus in the animals, the dynamics then of how they get to people, and then what happens in the people. And then finally, in this category of thinking about transmission, there's also a process by which intermediate or secondary hosts can play a role as well. So, for instance, Ebola can transmit directly from bats, people think, to people, but also it's found in apes in many parts of Central Africa and is being picked up in pigs. Cases, for instance, in Malaysia and in parts of Africa. And what can sometimes happen with viral dynamics is that these intermediate hosts can almost concentrate it. So it moves from a bat to a pig, it then kind of gets concentrated in the pig to the extent that it then passes more easily to people. This is known as amplification of transmission. Another example there would be a rather interesting case in Australia, which has emerged over the last decade or so, where there's a virus called Hendra, which is a little bit like Nipah virus, again causes really high fevers and encephalitis, and it's associated with that. But it doesn't pass to people except via the intermediate host of horses. And they've had all sorts of cases of Hendra virus, which have been only in people amongst vets and amongst racehorse owners. Very particular category of population. People thought, why is this peculiar disease happening amongst these particular people? And it was because they were very closely in touch with horses who were often grazing in fields with big bat colonies amongst them. There didn't seem to be a bat-people route, but somehow this gets concentrated in the horses and then passes to people. But then another way that I find quite interesting to kind of categorising zoonoses is actually about impact. And as I think would be clear to anybody really who's read the newspapers or watched the TV over the last decade or so, zoonoses have often hit the headlines. They evoke a lot of public fear and they often evoke big political responses. The threats that we saw a few years ago around pandemic flu, there was a big worry about swine flu. Well, swine flu actually became a global pandemic and was announced as such. And in a rather similar way, we saw the scares about avian flu. Partly, I think, these zoonoses hit the headlines, and they hit the headlines more when they seem to threaten really big centres of power. So in the case of flu, in the case of SARS caused by this coronavirus, what was of concern was actually rich, powerful northern countries who were sometimes seeing diseases that they sort of emerged out there somewhere. So there's quite a powerful narrative about out of Africa or out of Asia, these diseases are emerging somewhere remote, but they're actually, through travel and trade, coming to hit a powerful us in real centres of global power. That's partly why they attract attention. But that's actually quite a distorting way of thinking about impact, when actually what one could argue really matters, or at least also matters, are the zoonoses that are far more quietly, far more subtly, in ways that are often not recognised and certainly don't hit the headlines, destroying lives, making people sick, destroying livelihoods through affecting their animals in very poor places and amongst very poor people. And the Delia Grace piece there very much makes that argument. Their group from ILRI in Nairobi very much takes the view that zoonoses matter because of their impacts on the poor. Most of their kind of top 13 zoonoses are that top 13 because of their impact on poor people. And so it's the case that most policy, most media attention and most investment in research and attempts at control and surveillance tend to focus disproportionately on these. And indeed, many of the zoonoses that are in this kind of category also overlap with this other category of disease, the neglected tropical disease, NTDs as they're called. And there's a big overlap. A lot of NTDs are zoonoses. and a lot of zoonoses that really matter are actually quite neglected. So where do we go from here? Well, if we want to think in a little bit more detail about the processes through which zoonoses emerge, we've got a number of different kind of cycles and routes going on. And this is one way of kind of thinking about the mapping out what's happening. And this comes from the work of Delia Grace and others. And they distinguish what they call a sylvatic cycle. I think they're thinking about something that's happening, as it were, out there in the environment, in natural settings. And you've got a reservoir host, you've got perhaps a wildlife population of rodents, population of bats or something, which acts as a reservoir. You've got the virus swilling around in those populations. And then you've sometimes got it transmitting to vectors. Those might be insects very often. And it can cycle backwards and forwards between the vector and the reservoir. But then you also get the possibility of spillover to people who come to be a kind of secondary host for that virus. And that spillover can happen directly through direct transmission, but it can also be that it requires the vector for the human host to, as it were, get the disease. And then you get a cycle whereby the vector bites, it's a mosquito for instance, would bite the human, and then the virus cycles back between the vector and the people. There's then sometimes a process where once in people you get sustained transmission happening amongst people themselves. So you might get human to human transmission occurring, or you might have situations where this disease almost becomes established in a human population, but it needs constant contact and spillover between people and animals or people and the vet to be sustained. And once you've got a situation of sort of sustained transmission, you're into a different sort of cycle. Grace et al. Call this the peri-domestic cycle, in a way something going on around people's homes, or an urban cycle. This is sometimes what happens when things move from rural areas to urban areas. But then there's also this dynamic where you can have livestock involved. So there you might have something spilling over from wildlife into livestock, livestock acting as a secondary host and perhaps getting sick in their own right, and the virus circulating in the livestock population. And I think they then have also a process where you can get spillover then where people are getting the disease from animals. So these are all sort of possibilities. And this term spillover, which really just means the kind of spillover of a disease in animals into people, can mean any of these different points. And so lots of factors which can affect any of these areas. And this is why zoonotic diseases take us into quite a complex arena where you need to understand the different processes that might affect each of those things. So down here, it depends on what's the type of pathogen, whether you've got genetic mutations going on, whether it's specific to that host or whether it's actually something that's also transmitting amongst maybe different wildlife species, whether it's a single virus or whether there are actually different varieties of it and making it more or less likely that you'll get mutations that transmit to people. So lots of complexities around the virus. Lots of complexities and questions around the reservoir hosts and the likelihood of transmitting to anywhere else. Questions of habitat change, questions about biodiversity, questions about how dense that host population is. Do you have a very dense population of bats? No, it's more likely animals and people will come into contact with them or not. How dense are the populations of vectors? How likely is it that you'll get contact happening? Similarly, around this bit of the spillover diagram, lots of factors that might affect the potential shift between livestock and people, both to do with numbers of people and animals, but also to do with the ways that they're being kept or the kinds of interactions that people are having with them. So this is just one way of mapping out some of what's going on. This is the basic point, that we've got a lot of processes in play here around the dynamics of these diseases. Some of them are kind of viral pathogen dynamics at the level of biology of an individual organism. Some of them are to do with ecology, to do with the interactions between animals and vegetation and climate. Some of them are social, to do with people's behaviour and how they move around and interact with each other and with animals. And then some of them are political and economic, those wider drivers that affect patterns of livestock keeping, patterns of trade and travel and so on. A lot of different interacting scales, from the tiny, tiny micro of the pathogen itself, of the virus, to then individual animal and human bodies, up to these very global drivers. And that's all pretty complex. And what I think many researchers and policymakers have come to realise is that it absolutely needs an understanding across discipline. You need to have the biologists and the medics who can look at what's happening with the pathogens and happening with pathogens in bodies. You need the epidemiologists to look at those patterns of change. But you also need social scientists and environmental scientists. And it's quite interesting that there's been an increasing number of research programs in recent years that have deliberately tried to get big teams together. And indeed, we have a big project going on here based from IDS, this Dynamic Drivers of Disease in Africa consortium, which I've been leading. We're working with 19 partners in 8 different countries, 5 African countries, where we're looking at particular case studies of diseases. Trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness in Zambia and Zimbabwe. We're looking at Lassa fever in Sierra Leone. We're looking at bat-borne henipaviruses in Ghana. And we're looking at Rift Valley fever in Kenya. And in each of those countries, we're working with a team that includes some social scientists, some environmental scientists, and some vets and medical scientists. And then we've also got people from Kate Jones's lab in London who do this kind of macro mapping of ecology and climate and where diseases are emerging. And we've got a very high-level veterinary group at the University of Cambridge who were doing some of that veterinary pathogen-animal interaction. And it's complicated because these are all people who have enormous expertise and are able to use different kinds of modelling approach, but they come at a problem in very, very different ways. And our argument in this project, and indeed I think as many people are coming to realise, is that you need to be able to bring all those different kinds of knowledge and expertise together to understand what's going on in order then to be able to see where the intervention points might be for policy. So what are some of the conceptual frameworks then through which one might bring all these ideas together? Well, not surprisingly, they start to look a bit complicated. And so if we look in the literature, there are quite a lot of systems diagrams which attempt in a rather more complicated way to map out. One saw one in that little spillover diagram. But there are a variety of other systems approaches which attempt to say, OK, how can we think about how all these different factors, which different disciplines and groups might come to know about, are interplaying with each other. So this is one from Wilcox and Cowell, who are eco-health people, who divide their concerns into what's going on in your public health infrastructure, what's going on in environmental change, and what's going on in climate. And here they divide it into different scales. So you've got a kind of landscape level, you've got what's going on at a community level, and they're thinking not just about human communities, but about communities of wildlife and species. And then you've got what's going on within the particular dynamics of how hosts and pathogens relate to each other. And I'm not going to go through that in detail because partly it's just to illustrate to you that these things are complex and there are a lot of ways of characterising them. But Delia Grace and her colleagues simplify things a little bit further, and they have a model which basically says, this probably oversimplifies, but essentially their argument is that you've got more stuff happening, you've got more people, and you've got more agriculture and use of nature, as it were. And there are 2 key processes that leads to. On the one hand, as you have more people farming, using environments in crops, in livestock, one route is that it means they're expanding. You get spatial expansion of what people are doing, which brings people and their livestock more into contact with wildlife which might once have been out there in forests, out there in wild places, which are increasingly less wild because people and their animals are encroaching on them, and also bringing about changes in the habitats of those wildlife. So that's the kind of expansion side. And then on the other side, you get intensification, which is the other key process, where we're no longer allowing, say, for example, allowing cattle to graze on open pastures or keeping our hens in open backyard systems, but increase farming in a more intense way. And that also shifts the dynamics in a number of different ways. You've got changes in the habitats of animals, they're in closer contact with each other, greater opportunities for viruses to move around them. You've got more trade going along with those intensive systems, and you've also got decreasing diversity amongst your livestock because we're increasingly breeding for the purest cattle, the purest hens and so on. And there's quite a strong argument that as you get less diversity in an animal population, so you've got less spread, you've got less dilution effect of viruses. It's easier for those viruses to take hold. And then this was the diagram. This was our attempt in our Drivers of Disease programme with these 19 partners of great diversity to try and pull together how we would look at everything. So what we've done here is to say we've got a blue thing here which we can call a kind kind of local system. It might be a village, it might be a neighbourhood, it might be a section of an urban area, it might be a territory where you've got people and animals and livelihood systems. And you've got disease dynamics which are sitting between, on the one hand, people who are very differentiated and have goals around well-being and reduce poverty and are pursuing their livelihoods in order to live well and to survive. And in doing that, they make use of ecosystems in various different ways. We use the term here ecosystem services, which might have been something that you've come across, which is a way of looking at the different functions that an ecology has for people. They provide things, they provide food and fuel, people go out and gather and produce. They have a regulating role because soils and climate and so on help to keep a system stable, and biodiversity is important there. They have a supporting role to livelihood activities, supporting agriculture, supporting water provision and so on. And there are also cultural ecosystem services, which really captures all the reasons why people go into ecologies: for leisure, for aesthetic reasons, for ritual purposes, for spiritual purposes, and so on. So there's people interacting with ecosystems in lots of different ways, and the disease dynamics emerge here through people's interactions, how they come into contact with animals and with potential viral reservoirs in nature. Those local systems are in turn affected by a lot of wider drivers which are shaping how those systems are changing over time, and that might be things about changing land use, population and so on. It's also going to be economic factors, things like changes in prices which shift whether it's viable to produce livestock in a certain way, and other things, changes in politics, conflict and so on, can all affect those local systems. But then what we've also done in this framework is to add a layer, which I'll come to in a minute when we think about narratives, which is to say, okay, we can go and identify and measure all of these factors in an objective way, but we also have to take into account different kinds of knowledge and the different priorities and the different imaginations and narratives and stories, actually, that different people will tell about those. And so how we begin to look at a system like this depends on who we are and the kinds of assumptions we bring to bear and the questions we ask, but also why we think it matters. And here, if we look at most diseases, we can see some big differences between the kinds of knowledge and perspectives that one might find, for instance, among local people, amongst frontline agricultural extensionists or health workers, amongst government departments, or indeed amongst the international world. And so in this project, we've been doing quite a lot of work to say for each of those disease case studies, you've got a kind of political economy of different people saying different things about why it matters. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. If one thinks about that middle section, that interaction between people and ecologies, I just thought I'd run quickly through some of the key factors and processes that literature is picking out as being important. And we've talked about some of these already. So first of all, picking up on the sort of livestock system element of this, the ways that people are interacting with livestock. We've talked about increased populations, not just of people, but also of animals. And pigs and poultry are really critical here. We're in a bit of a phase at the moment where, especially in certain parts of the world, in sort of the rising economies of Asia and Latin America, where meat diets are part of the kind of aspirations of rising middle classes and so on, there's a big shift towards intensification of production of pigs, often in many systems, and of poultry. And so it's not just more, it's also the fact that they're being produced in increasingly industrial, intensive methods. And those intensive methods, keeping animals very close together, tend to favour transmission of disease between them. And actually also transmission to people. Typically in these very industrial production units, you don't have quite so many workers in a kind of factory farm, but those workers that you do have more exposure to those pathogens. So, for instance, in the so-called swine flu case of 2009, it seems to have been highly intensive pig production units in Mexico, where the workers in those, who were probably also not respecting sanitary standards because they were pretty poorly paid, they were in outsourced end of the production chain in a political economic setting where sanitary standards probably weren't terribly well upheld. It was those workers who were vulnerable, and they were the initial people who got this flu, and then it began to spread. There's also this point that I mentioned earlier, some research suggesting that also the tendency towards having less genetic diversity in livestock as we've tried to breed for bigger, fatter, better meat producing animals is enabling the viral pathogens to be more virulent. And there's a certain amount of modelling work that suggests that it's easier for a kind of epidemic in an animal population to take off when that's a very undiverse population. Whereas if you had lots of genetic diversity in your animals, it would spread. And then we've got this question about movements. I mean, our contemporary livestock systems involve a lot of shifting of animals around for trade, for going to slaughter and so on, and also a lot of input and deliveries of industrial products and so on. And all of this tends to increase the routes through which diseases might spread from an animal population to those elsewhere. We've also got another dynamic, which is the use of drugs and antibiotics and antimicrobials as part of livestock production, which is increasingly the case, not just to head off disease, but also to promote growth, almost using antibiotics in a sort of prophylactic way to head off any infections that might emerge. And that has led to quite a lot of resistance in places, and that's allowed diseases to take hold. And that's been part of the dynamic around salmonella, around Campylobacter is a big one that causes diarrheas. The foodborne bacterial pathogens one, it's about the ways that as you cure something with antimicrobial and antibiotics, you can sometimes create a new niche in that animal's body into which other pathogens can emerge. So there are dynamics there. There are also questions about the ways that waste disposal happens and the use in many livestock systems of the waste from those animals as fertiliser on fields, or indeed there are some systems in Asia where waste from animals, particularly from pig production systems, is then put into fish ponds to get fish growing in aquaculture systems incredibly well. Now that's very good for your fish production, and arguably it's a nice bit of recycling, but it's also thought to bring about some risks of some other diseases and transmission in those water supplies. And then questions about the ways you manage other aspects of the system. Water, for instance. Rift Valley fever, which I talked about earlier, which has tended to have an epidemic dynamic, that it has only been associated with times of the year or particular bits of longer-term climatic cycles when you've had a lot of standing water around, and your mosquitoes can really thrive and then transmit this disease between animals and people. But in parts of East Africa, where agricultural policy has led to dams and irrigation, you now have standing water bodies there throughout the year, and that seems to have enabled more epidemics to happen and actually a new emerging kind of endemic pattern where there are some highly irrigated places that have Rift Valley fever most of the time. So again, irrigation can be fantastically good for increasing agricultural production, but there's some downsides that we need to be aware of. And in a similar kind of way, just as the use of antimicrobials in livestock production is good for increasing livestock fattening and production, that has some downsides. The use of fertilisers in agriculture can have some disease risk effects because it creates very nutrient-rich conditions which are then affecting your insect dynamics in soils. Now, none of this is to say that we shouldn't irrigate, we shouldn't give antibiotics to our livestock, and that we shouldn't necessarily use eco-health recycling systems around reuse of waste. But what this emerging work is showing is that that can actually lead us to new risks that we don't know about. So this is quite a frontier area of work. And then you end up in a kind of trade-off situation where you have to think about, okay, what matters? So this was finally one more factor where we're thinking about increased marketing and trade routes along large areas. The avian flu dynamic was very much affected by the trade in wild birds and also in poultry. And Rift Valley fever, which I was just talking about, does seem now to have spread through the cattle trade to some other parts of the world altogether. So we've got clearly some wider drivers of these dynamics, things to do with diet and lifestyles, intensifying livestock production, consumption patterns, changing middle classes, insistence on eating meat. We've got political economic factors, which are about how you produce livestock as cheaply as possible in factory conditions, but they're also associated with new risks and uncertainties. And I think it leads us to need to ask questions here about what are some of the trade-offs, who is gaining from these sometimes huge increases in productivity, improvements in diet and so on, but actually who's losing? And sometimes those who are losing are your vulnerable workers who then get diseases, or people who are actually at the sharp end of those interacting dynamics. It's quite often poor people in their livelihoods that are losing out from actually bigger processes which are geared towards industrial production. Just quickly to zip through in a similar kind of way, these interactions between wildlife and people and disease. And I think the key dynamics that are being talked about there are really, as I've mentioned, the sense that we've got these as it were, natural habitats in forests, in vegetation, in wildlife-rich zones, which are increasingly being fragmented and broken up. They're being encroached on by people and their systems. They're being often turned into agricultural environments, or they're being urbanised, and increasingly people are moving into those places. Now, that has an effect on those wildlife populations. It sometimes can mean that they move. So one of the dynamics that one sees is where wildlife actually move for feeding sources or for habitat into places where people are. And this is very much part of what one's seen going on with bats, actually, where big colonies of bats have moved out of forests to be in places where people are, where they often end up sharing food sources and living on agricultural wastes or picking up fruit that comes from fruit trees that people have planted. So moving into suburban and urban areas. The biggest bat colony in West Africa is actually found in the trees above the main hospital in Accra. Fascinating, actually, and a real irony there. That's just where they are. So there are all these people coming to hospital and all these bats up here, hundreds of thousands of them, feeding on the debris and the fruit that hospital visitors leave lying around, and all harbouring Nipah virus, actually. So that's quite interesting, and we've got researchers looking at that in our project. But there's also this biodiversity feature that actually has some of the trends in environment have led to less biodiversity in nature, which means you get less of a dilution effect, both within species but also between species. So if, for instance, you've got a rodent that harbours Lassa fever, in a very biodiverse situation, there are going to be lots of different rodent species about, and only one perhaps has this disease, and they will all be competing with each other for food and so on, and some of them might be being wiped out by other predators. As you lose some of that biodiversity, the populations which are harbouring your disease, the particular species, there isn't that dilution effect in predator-prey relationships, in competition for food and so on. So the ones that are hosting the pathogens can really flourish. This is a similar kind of example with tsetse fly in southern Africa, where with the clearance of a lot of natural vegetation, you've had big wildlife species, antelopes and so on, disappearing. And that sometimes led to the disappearance of tsetse fly because they were both feeding on and infecting wildlife as well as livestock. But there are also other theories that actually wildlife can serve as a bit of a buffer, and so when you've got wildlife and cattle, as long as you've got the wildlife, then the tsetse are circulating amongst all of them, but remove the wildlife and they can really concentrate in the cattle. Big unanswered questions about how these things work out. As people and their livestock come into closer proximity with wildlife, you get new opportunities for pathogens to spill over, and you also get more opportunities for direct transmission then between wildlife and people. I've talked a little bit about sharing space and food sources. That bat example is one. There are also many livelihood interactions that people become involved in, which bring them into contact with wildlife. And those include ones that actually use wildlife directly as food sources, if people are hunting or processing bushmeat. Bats are a big source of bushmeat in many parts of Africa. Hunting of apes and other animals has been perhaps part of the transmission of Ebola, as I think we'll look at later. And people also use wildlife in various forms of ritual and traditional medicines. So those are also possibilities for spillover. But then there are also livelihood activities or uses of ecosystem services that involve people going into the places where you find animals that may bring risk. Okay, if people are going into a forest to gather food, to gather fuel, or if they're farming and out in the bush in places where you might get rodents swilling around your farmhouse and so on. So again, a lot of these dynamics of agricultural encroachment, the breakup of wild habitats and so on, loss of wildlife and so on, are all shaped by wider drivers that are affecting investment, sometimes the use of forests and agriculture for commercial purposes, large-scale land investments, forms of change that are sometimes moving smallholders off their land, pushing them into more marginal areas where they're in contact with wildlife and so on, as well as policies around conservation, which may work either way. If you've got a conservation policy that protects lots of wildlife, that may be great for ecotourism, it may be great for broader aims of environmental sustainability and biodiversity into the future, but it might also be protecting wildlife populations that are also a source of disease. So again, we've got some big trade-offs here. We need to think about the value values of ecosystems, the values of animals for different people, but also some of the disease risks. And sometimes, again, who is gaining and who is losing? The people who are profiting from game conservation as tourists or as wildlife hunters or as governments from revenues are not necessarily the people who are going to be vulnerable to disease from those wildlife. Just in sum, we've got lots of processes which have created new opportunities for spillover and amplification. We've got wider drivers of change. And the argument for why we're seeing zoonoses emerging now is that there's an acceleration in those change processes, particularly that we've seen over the last sort of half century or so. And if those changes are going to continue to intensify, maybe, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg and we'll see greater problems into the future. But this is a cutting-edge set of research areas, and to date, I don't think we have enough understanding of these complex and often not necessarily sort of linear and straightforward interactions. And that makes it quite difficult to see where the intervention points might be to manage those risks. This brings us to an area where I think we need to think rather harder about the politics of knowledge. If we can't necessarily know the details of those dynamics in full, it's not necessarily a question of saying, okay, we know what the risks are because these are the possible things that might happen and these are the probabilities of them. And that's an approach to risk, and you can kind of manage risk. But what we're talking about around many zoonoses are uncertainties and areas of ignorance. They're unknowns, or things are uncertain. We know some of the things that might happen, but you can't put a kind of neat probability on them. You can't do a sort of decent risk analysis. And one of the responses to situations of real unknowns and uncertainties is to say what you actually need to do is get multiple forms of knowledge together, so you can look at the problem from lots of different angles and weigh up the possibilities and take a process of slightly more informed judgment. So one of the questions, I think, for a One Health approach is to say, what kinds of knowledge do we need, whose forms of knowledge are out there, and how can we better bring together these kinds of knowledges so to end up with a slightly richer picture. But there are also questions then, again, about what you do, what sorts of interventions are envisaged, and what kinds of effects those might have, because there are some real trade-offs at stake. If you weigh in and try and do something about ecosystem dynamic, you've got livelihood interests wrapped up with those, you've got economic interests in using a resource, as well as the disease issues. So we're often having to trade off one against the other. And this is where I and some other people have found the idea of thinking about narratives and trying to unpick the different narratives that one's got in play about a particular zoonotic disease, or indeed about an epidemic, as quite useful, because any of these complex situations can be subjected to a whole set of different narratives, and different actors will have different narratives about the nature of the problem, what kind of knowledge is relevant, and why it matters, and therefore what you should do about it. So what's a narrative? A policy narrative is really just a kind of simple storyline that justifies particular sorts of action or intervention. They're produced by particular people and institutions. They often have quite a simple structure. The beginning is a system framed in a particular way. You're interested in certain things, but perhaps not particularly interested in others. The middle is what you do about it. And the end is what you're aiming at. What are your goals? Are your goals around improved human health? Are your goals around protecting wildlife, and so on? But mostly around most of these sort of policy narratives, there's also a process of assigning blame and responsibility there. So part of the narrative is about saying who should do what, who's to blame for the problem, who needs to amend their ways, and who's in a position to act on it, towards an end, which might be about kind of stopping a pandemic, controlling a zoonosis, or it might be an economic end. You might have something else in mind. If we think about zoonotic diseases, just at the most global level, there are a lot of different narratives out there which one can pick out. They have their different versions around particular diseases, but in general, just some of those that are in play, we've raised a few of them, and they exist in a kind of hierarchy, actually, in terms of how dominant and prevailing they are and how much power they have behind them. So amongst big narratives about pandemics and zoonoses, there is this one major one, which is that we've got the potential for big pandemics sitting out there in Africa, in Asia, in wild places. It often goes along with a view of slightly kind of primitive populations, and I'm very disparaging this narrative, which is likely to emerge and threaten the world. And I call that out of Africa, out of Asia narrative. I don't know if any of you saw the film Contagion, the big Hollywood blockbuster that was doing the rounds of the cinemas a couple of years ago. Worth watching, actually, as an example of this dominant pandemic narrative. This is a Hollywood story about, it's actually a kind of Nipah virus that emerges through a bat example out in forests in Asia and then infects Gwyneth Paltrow, who eats Chinese food in a restaurant, and then it goes global. It's actually quite entertaining because there's actually lots of stuff that we covered in our vaccines example in there as well about can you produce a vaccine and are people worried about it, and vaccines versus homeopathy and so on. I recommend watching this movie, but with your critical head on, okay? This is partly a dominant narrative because it's one that's very wrapped up with fear, the idea that there are viruses out there, they're coming to get us. But that's rather different from another narrative which says these things matter because they're local and they're killing people in particular places. You need emergency response to quell them at source because they're killing people locally. There's another sort of related narrative which says, it's really the neglected tropical disease narrative that says there are many more zoonoses than we realise, they're neglected, they're under-recognised, they're under-prioritised in policy and investment, they're silent killers. So the policy response is that you need to reverse this neglect. And then we have this rapidly rising narrative about One Health. Now, what we're really talking about there is an argument that human health, animal health, and the health of ecosystems are all intertwined and therefore have to be addressed together in integrated interventions. Now, it doesn't give one a recipe for what an integrated intervention would look like. In some way, it's an integrated intervention that needs to address all those complexities that we were just looking at the same time. But there are a lot of trade-offs that might come around priorities in that area. There's a lot we don't know, and those are all challenges to One Health. There are also challenges to One Health that emerge from the fact that it's basically brought three very different policy communities together. So the arguments for One Health really emerged from the coming together of the WHO with its focus very much on human health, the OIE, which is the Office for Animal Health, which is really the big global organisation of the veterinary profession, and then those arguing from a kind of environmental ecosystem perspective, and particularly wildlife ecologists. And in some respects, this has been an opportunity for vets and the sort of animal health and veterinary profession, who have often been quite marginalised on the global stage, suddenly to have a role and to be part of a bigger set of political and policy responses that attract more importance because they're about people. But actually doing that integration in practice has proved difficult because vets and medics and environmental people often think in rather different ways. They do have different priorities, they have different kinds of training, and doing that sort of integrated research and policy together has proved quite hard. And so in some quarters there's now a view that One Health is a great slogan, but there are really very few examples of implementing it in practice on the ground. And there's a little bit of disaffection with the idea. Is it really doable? Is it just rhetoric? What does it really mean in practice? These are all, as it were, out there in the policy world, but there are also some, what I would see as kind of alternative narratives in this debate, which perhaps need a bit more attention. One of them would be to say that local experiences and knowledges around these interactions matter and might need to be given greater weight in this debate. So this would be looking into work on indigenous ecological knowledge, on medical anthropology and what it's said about cultural understandings of disease. Often the local wisdom about animals and ecologies and nature and environments that often underpin subsistence livelihoods and people's ways of living with and interacting with nature, often in quite sustainable ways. And similarly, living with disease. And one of the arguments that's little silenced at the moment but is being listened to a little bit more is to say that the One Health debate also needs to draw on participatory epidemiology that can actually bring these knowledges into the debate. One of the things we're trying to do in our Drivers of Disease programme is to bring what we've called participatory modelling, where you're drawing on local experiences and knowledge and people's own mental models of how they and their animals are moving about in the landscape, and as it were modelling those in participatory ways through maps and diagrams and so on, and bringing those alongside and attempting to draw them together with epidemiological models and ecological models and mathematical models. And those things are partly important because they give one a better handle on how you could then balance health interventions or ecosystem interventions with respect for people's livelihood needs and their rights, their control over resources, their control over their bodies. Just very quickly, I wanted just to run through how different kinds of narratives might apply to a single disease. Now, I'm going to pick up here on Ebola. I'm not talking here now about the actual dynamics of transmission and what you do about them, but about the narratives that have emerged. Ebola has been seen as a scary disease because it has rather nasty symptoms. It can lead to kind of bleeding from orifices. It's rapid killing. And it came to light and came to public and policy attention in the late 1980s, early 90s particularly. And there have been at least 4 very distinct narratives that I think one can pick out as justifying very different kinds of policy response, which see this disease and why it matters in very different ways. And these are basically the 4. So firstly, the kind of dominant view has seen Ebola very much as a global threat, and the narrative will go a little bit like this. So you've got an emerging and very fierce virus which is emerging in distant places in forests, and it's now threatening to spread very rapidly in our interconnected world. So there's a need to identify and respond really rapidly to these outbreaks and to get the international community involved. And this was very much what was going on when Ebola came to be recognised in the early to mid-1990s. It was elaborated in, again, a lot of popular fiction and media. So there was a film, a little bit like the Contagion film of a couple of years ago. There was one in 1995 called Outbreak, which starred a lot of stars at the time, Dustin Hoffman and others, and it was very much this narrative story. Another one worth watching, actually. But also some popular science writing and journalism, Richard Preston's book The Hot Zone, Laurie Garrett's book The Coming Plague, which painted this picture of a devastating threat. And it was one that some of the big international organisations, the WHO, the Centres for Disease Control, Atlanta, very much picked up on and geared their responses accordingly. So in terms of the framing of the problem there, it's very much global. It's global security that we're thinking about. But often the global means rich northern populations, rather interesting. There's a bit of a slippage there. The virus itself is almost seen to have agency in this. I mean, it's quite interesting, the idea of a kind of predatory virus. And this is a piece of popular science writing from Dorothy Crawford. And just see what she says. It's the Ebola virus. It's almost as if it's doing this on purpose. It's there to get us, in a way. But there are also other key agents in this. There are heroic scientists. The CDC guy who comes in from America and is always featured in these Hollywood films, discovers, identifies, deals with it, these kind of heroism stories. But there are some other people who are represented in far more problematic ways, and this narrative casts, in particular, people who live in these African forests where this virus was seen to emerge, as primitive and carrying out all kinds of primitive practices which are at the heart of enabling this virus to emerge. These are the people who eat monkeys, who have all these bizarre tribal rituals that involve using animal body parts. Really disparaging stuff which one sees in these films and in media coverage, and then drove these big international responses, and in particular the 1995 Ebola outbreak in Zaire, as it was, in a place called Kikwit, is seen to have been a big stimulus for then a decade of work which led to the creation of a new set of international health regulations in 2005, which basically said it is the responsibility of any national government to alert the international community of an emerging epidemic in its borders so that the international community can respond. That became international law, and it was very much driven by this kind of narrative about Ebola. So that's a global view, but there's a very different narrative that says these actually matter because of what they do to local populations. So that's the reason for containing them. It's still an argument for rapid response and for, as it were, getting international teams to fly in from outside and implement a quite standard set of public health measures. But the kind of reasoning is a bit different, and the reasoning is that these are devastating disease events locally. And so this is the kind of narrative that one finds underlying the outbreak alert and response programs which exist in all the big international agencies. There's one in the WHO which is called GOAN, which is the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Node, I think, and the Centres for Disease Control has another one. And interviews that I did with a number of WHO officials in that programme talked very strongly about actually how Ebola control, as a kind of exemplar outbreak, they talked about it as peppering the history of the creation of this unit. So some of the assumptions in outbreaks then, the focus is very much on the short-term outbreak, on impact on more local framing. You don't exactly know when the kind of shock of an outbreak is going to occur. So the idea of GOAN was that you have a responsive sort of network of agencies on hold, ready to respond, incorporating international teams and local government personnel. The kind of knowledge involved in this was very much standard public health knowledge and responses and formal epidemiology. And these would underlie what came to be a very standardised technical response, where these teams would arrive, they'd go into an outbreak area, they'd do some interviews to trace who the initial case and contacts might have been. Then you implement isolation measures, you isolate those contacts and sick people, and you do sort of barrier nursing. So it was straight public health responses, which proved to be quite effective. But what also went along very much with this approach was still to see local people in these areas without very much to contribute, basically as quite ignorant. We needed our public health experts to come in, but also still as mired in rather misguided tradition and cultural practices, so which needed to be restricted. So, for instance, it was often argued that people's funeral practices and the ways they liked to bury their people who'd passed away from Ebola were part of perpetuating the epidemics and led to more human-to-human transmission. So these general, very top-down approaches were often perceived locally as pretty unjust and actually really overly restrictive and quite offensive around things that actually really matter. Understandably, they were resisted. In 1995, those responses in the Kikwit situation in Zaire and then to some others in Gabon of this sort really wound people up to the point that when there was another outbreak in Gabon in 2001, American and French teams arrived in these villages and people said, "Get out, we don't want you here." And they actually chased them off. And that was because they'd basically been so offended by what had happened a few years earlier. So as part of the response actually to that resistance, WHO thought, actually, what are we going to do about this? Clearly isn't working. And began to draw some community educators and people who could try to generate more effective community outreach into their programs. And they also drew, interestingly, on some anthropologists. And there was a particular anthropologist called Barry Hewlett who wrote quite a nice book about all of this called Ebola, Culture and Context, who had been working in that region doing other things, studies of pygmy groups and parenthood and so on, but got interested and rather disturbed by what was happening. And he managed to kind of infiltrate himself into some of these teams. That, in a way, is a story in itself. And pioneered a kind of outbreak anthropology, where he did a lot of interviews with local people, which proved very enlightening in terms of showing how the contact tracing was working, but also began to explain to some of these outbreak control teams why it was that their strategies weren't working and were so offensive and people were resisting them, by revealing what people were worried about and actually showing that actually they had some quite sensible knowledge which might be drawn into these response strategies. And this began to work, and by the time I interviewed these WHO people in 2008, they were saying things like this: anthropological integration is now a key pillar of our response strategy. Didn't always mean having anthropologists there, but it certainly did mean having community outreach workers who could listen to people and get a better relationship going. Now, why was that? It's essentially because these disease dynamics are complicated, and actually there's often a quite important role for local knowledge in explaining what's happened in a particular setting. It was also because it came to be found, as one looked a little bit harder, that actually local people were not ignorant at all, but had been living with this disease for quite a long time and had developed their own ways of understanding and dealing with it and responding to it. I mean, this went on into other contexts. In Uganda, where again they'd had a series of outbreaks, one of the cases that's worked through quite nicely amongst the Acholi people there suggests that actually people had already been dealing with Ebola and had a notion of outbreak, of an epidemic disease at a time when a disease moved from being just something in the population to having an outbreak. They would talk about it in a very different way. They had this term called GEMO to describe it, and would immediately implement a range of local isolation procedures, including putting a kind of forked stick outside the house of somebody who was sick, making sure that only people who had had and survived the disease nursed patients who currently had it, and modifying their burial practices accordingly. And once these things were understood, it was much easier to adapt isolation procedures to build on and make use of and draw people into them, and also enabled kind of slight rethinking to try and balance things like people's rights to bury their dead and look after their sick, and the emotional dimensions of disease with disease control. That's quite a positive story. The further layer, the further narrative about Ebola, I think is still thoroughly unsolved, which would be to say, okay, these perhaps aren't just short-term things that happen in particular places, but they're a manifestation of some of these longer-term drivers in how people are relating to bats and other animals. And it might need us not just to address these as public health crises as they emerge, but to think rather harder and think about addressing some of these other causes, which potentially brings in a range of other policy actors. But as yet, there isn't a single storyline and set of responses. So I was reflecting on how these narratives merge together. I think what we begin to see is some roles for alternative combinations of knowledge. Could we think about bringing together local knowledges and sort of more participatory approaches to thinking about people and health and animals, with perhaps some of the approaches which would enable us to understand these longer-term dynamics? And we also perhaps might need to think about responses that aren't just about trying to control things over the short term, but also to respond in a more flexible and adaptive way to some of these longer-term processes of change. So I think these are some of the front-line areas of thinking in a One Health arena. In the meantime, I think those four narrative areas, as we can see, differ a lot. They differ according to the actors who are putting them forward, to who's being blamed for the problem. Are you blaming local people? Are you blaming wider drivers? They're operating at different scales, local and global. They're valuing different kinds of knowledge. Is it just the epidemiologists and the medics? Is it also local knowledge? And also they've got different views as to how much uncertainty one appreciates. In practice, I think, in particular responses, bits of this coexist. One of the more recent Ebola outbreaks in Uganda combined, really, a top-down international outbreak approach with some attention to community responses and local knowledge, and some interest in thinking about what were the dynamics in nature and people's interactions with animals which had enabled this particular outbreak to happen at that time. But I think it does leave us with a challenge to understand not just the actual dynamics that are unfolding, but at how different policy actors are coming together around particular zoonoses, often with different assumptions, but also with different pressures behind them to act in certain ways and different assumptions about how you go forward in a context which is complex and uncertain. Coming out of this thinking are some policy pointers which we put in a small policy briefing, which is that rather than simply responding to zoonotic outbreaks in a top-down single outbreak way, there are some longer-term challenges as well. You often need to have longer-term funding, you need to have an appreciation of uncertainty and planning for uncertain futures. You need to be able to have means in place for improving how one understands and maps out these dynamics, and to be able to do surveillance, not just of a disease when it emerges or becomes manifest in human populations, but actually to look at the whole system and pick up on where some of the trigger points might be. What are the points of vulnerability in your kind of human-animal disease system? And that in turn creates challenges for getting different kinds of groups, vets, medics, environmental scientists, local people, working together in a more collaborative way, which recognises and values their different kinds of expertise. And that these might be some of the factors that you need to bring together if you're going to develop an approach to One Health that is not just about tackling disease, but about doing so in a way that is also development focused, that's supporting people's rights and building rather than working against justice in terms of how people are living.